Not long after King George III took the throne of Great Britain and Ireland in 1760, Britain's gains in the 7 Years' War made him the ruler of one of the great global empires of the age. But the might of King George's empire would not go unchallenged for long.
It's true, it's a short period of history. I mean, I think partly, if you look at the history of British legislation between, roughly, 1750s and 1776, then it doesn't seem surprising.
Heavily in war debt, Parliament claimed American colonists would pay for their fair share of the debt with higher taxes. Molasses, lead, glass, and paper, even playing cards, quickly became targets. But the taxes weren't only about money. They were also about control. Having proven its military might, Britain was prepared to ensure economic dominance as well. There was no room for any new economic competition, especially not from within the British Empire itself.
One of the acts that has always, helped me understand things was an act that the colonies couldn't manufacture their own goods. So they weren't supposed to be manufacturing cloth. They weren't supposed to be manufacturing iron goods. And to the degree that they had started to set up things like foundries, they were forced to tear them down and not employ them. And there, you can just see over several decades this pattern, a real pattern on the part of the British Empire to reduce the capacity of the colonies to acquire self-sufficiency.
On a cold December night in Boston, 1773, a group of men gathered down by the harbor and silently snuck aboard 3 British merchant ships. Within a few hours, the men had dumped every ounce of the ship's cargo. 342 chests of heavily taxed tea. All of it went overboard into the frigid harbor waters. The Boston Tea Party would embolden the colonists and enrage the British. By 1774, the colonies had chosen the men who would ultimately challenge the king and his powerful empire, and change the course of history. Their names are now the stuff of legend. But in 1774, these men were rather ordinary citizens. Among them were George Washington of Virginia, a former militiaman who had retired in 1758, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, a judge with no formal legal education, Thomas Jefferson, an eccentric and reclusive intellectual, rarely seen outside of his grand Virginian estate, and John Adams of Massachusetts, a fiery lawyer who loved his books. Adams wrote to his beloved wife Abigail, "We live, my dear soul, in an age of trial. What will be the consequence, I know not." The Adams and the world were about to find out.
So that period from 1774 to 1776 is interesting to me because it's really about, you can use the language of tipping point, right? You start off with a few radicals who can see a path forward, and then the question is, what does it take for everybody else to come around with them such that by July 4th, 1776, you can have the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States.
Parliament's response to the Boston Tea Party was swift and harsh. The colony of Massachusetts was stripped of its right to self-governance, and the port of Boston was shut down. Still, the colonies had not yet given up hope that the king and Parliament would hear their complaints. They were not yet looking to revolt. They were looking to negotiate.
In various ways, each colony had, at particular points in time, been sending letters of complaint to Britain about particular policies. And starting out of Massachusetts, there was an effort to start sharing these efforts, to collaborate on them. And a point came at which they thought that they needed to just send shared messages to Britain. And that was really the origins for Continental Congress. So that's the important turning point moment there, where the sense of grievance against the king had culminated in an agreement to collaborate.
By the fall of 1774, delegates from all corners of the colonies were on their way to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They were farmers and lawyers, merchants and soldiers. They rode to Pennsylvania to demand the freedom to conduct their lives free from burdensome taxation and direct parliamentary control. They couldn't know then what the coming months had in store. So why these men? Why now?
Well, to some extent, I think they had, had a lot of good fortune and luck. So the Atlantic Ocean, made a big difference. They'd had the space to learn how to run their own lives. So for all the breadth of the British Empire, it had governed its colonies with a relatively light hand and, small numbers of military and that sort of thing, especially sort of in the earliest years. The people who assembled in Philadelphia were among the best educated people that have ever assembled in any place, anytime, anywhere. And obviously in Europe, the 1600s and 1700s were a period of great philosophical innovation and political thinking as people in various ways challenged the concept of monarchy. And this group of people in Philadelphia was ready to draw on all of that.
Between 1774 and 1776, Continental Congress would convene in Philadelphia 3 times, each meeting more urgent than the last. Their written accounts are our only window into these months of historical meetings, boisterous pub arguments, and private political musings.
If you look at the letters of the men in Continental Congress, you'll see both these wonderful snapshots of actual conversations they had in the bar, in the tavern with so-and-so, or the sermon they went to hear last Sunday where, there's this great one that John Adams described where a minister called Duffel describes the course of events as requiring independence and overthrowing the king who's like a pharaoh. And so you can see the ideas that are in the Declaration developing. And so it's not just that you can see the pieces of the conversation, but you can also see when people are talking behind each other's backs and so forth. So we just have a window into the actual politicking of the period.
The business of Congress is tedious beyond expression. Every man in it is a great man, an orator, a critic, a statesman. The consequence of this is that business is drawn and spun out to an immeasurable length.
There's this incredible letter from Edward Rutledge of South Carolina to John Jay of New York in the period of the debates over the Declaration where he says, "Get your butt back here to Philadelphia. I can't believe what these people are doing, the kinds of leveling principles," that's his language he's using, that they're introducing in these arguments, and you've got to get back here and help me stop it. But at the same time, they're constantly writing letters back home to wives, but also to politicians who are back home. And in each, they're desperately seeking news. And you have to remember, right, this is a period where the news didn't travel instantaneously. So just in order to know what was going on, they had to be sort of sucking information from anybody they knew in other parts of the colonies.
As tensions rose between the colonies and the British, news became even more invaluable. By the time delegates gathered in Pennsylvania for the second time, in the summer of 1775, shots had already been fired at Lexington and Concord. The British were conducting military raids up and down the New England coast. As the new delegates rode north to Philadelphia, couriers from Boston raced south to bring Congress news of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Congress needed news as fast as a horse and rider could carry it. That meant news from Boston might reach Philadelphia within a week. And they needed it from everywhere.
In the fall of 1775, October, I think, Congress put ads in all the newspapers all over the colonies asking people to write into them with their accounts of what the British were up to and their opinions of what the British were doing.
Meanwhile, it was becoming increasingly clear that reconciliation with the British might no longer be possible. But what the colony's next steps might be, no one yet knew. John Adams was among those determined to figure it out.
I mean, the letters between John and Abigail Adams are amazing, and Abigail is always reporting, that she's just seen so-and-so, and they've been talking about Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and John was always, he did not like Tom Paine's Common Sense, and in fact, his own pamphlets and thoughts on government was his effort to do better than Tom Paine, and so you can tell every time that Abigail's sharing with him another point where somebody else is talking about Tom Paine again, he's very annoyed and he wants to get the subject back to his own contributions to figuring out right forms of government.
And this was no easy task. But as 1775 wore on and tensions continued to rise, the question of independence became increasingly more urgent. But even as late as early 1776, not all of the colonies were on the same page.
I mean, Massachusetts was really a hotbed of radicalism. It was the most radical of the colonies from the earliest point. And in Massachusetts, once fighting had begun, opinion sort of crystallized quite quickly on the side of the radicals.
Yet, even in radical Massachusetts, the movement towards declaring official support for independence was painfully slow. The road to popular support was even rockier in other colonies. Rhode Island worried about massive backlash from the colony's Quaker population. New York refused to declare a position. It was North Carolina that became the first colony to officially empower its delegates to Congress to support independence. This set the stage for their neighbor to the north, the colony's economic powerhouse, Virginia.
Virginia was a tricky place. I mean, the Virginians had strong ties to England, and the aristocratic culture of Virginia meant that there was a certain sort of weight against revolution. Yet Virginia was also the most populous colony. It was the wealthiest colony. So if Virginia wasn't going to kind of come round, then there wasn't really a way of acting as a group altogether.
But in November of 1775, Virginia's tipping point came, thanks to Lord Dunmore, royal governor of the colony. Faced with growing popular support for independence, Lord Dunmore attempted to turn the tide in Britain's favor by offering freedom to any slaves who fought against the rebels. It was a fatal mistake that quickly turned Virginia's aristocratic elite against the British and tipped the scales in the colonists' favor. Virginia's instructions to their delegates were clear: to move towards dissolving the connection between America and Great Britain, totally, finally, and irrevocably. Within days, others followed suit. New Jersey even arrested their loyalist colonial governor, William Franklin, son of prominent patriot Benjamin Franklin. Yet even with many colonies declaring their support for independence, in the early months of 1776, a true consensus remained elusive. The colonies had not yet formed the united front necessary to challenge the supremacy of one of the world's most powerful empires. But the men who gathered in Philadelphia had one last hand to play.
The third thing that really made the difference was in the spring of 1776, John Adams and Richard Henry Lee worked really hard to show people how to build new governments in the place of dissolving colonial administrations. John Adams was a very strategic political thinker, so he showed up after the winter recess in the 75-76 Congress with a to-do list of things he hoped to accomplish in the spring session. And, talk about ambition. The fourth item on his list was governments to be assumed in every colony. So leaving colonial status behind and becoming states in every colony. And then the 14th item on his list was Declaration of Independency, Articles of Confederation, treaties with foreign powers. So he set his sights high, but his priority actually put building constitutions above declaring independence.
By July 1776, Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, New Jersey, and New Hampshire have each drafted a state constitution.
I think that's the thing that really brought everybody over. Once they could imagine the new thing they would be building and actually start building it, then it became possible to let go of the old thing.
When it came down to it, out of all the bright men gathered in Philadelphia, only a small group could tackle the task of drafting the document that would declare the colony's independence, effectively declare war with the mighty British Empire, and justify the colony's actions to the whole world.
The right answer to the question of who wrote the Declaration of Independence is Continental Congress. And then, if you want layers beyond that, then the Committee of Five that submitted the Declaration to Congress. And then within that Committee of Five, so the Committee of Five was Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. The most important contributors on the committee were Jefferson, of course, and then Adams and Franklin.
Of these 5 men, 2 stand out: John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. The 2 men could not have been more different. Yet, without both, the Declaration as we know it today would not exist.
If I had a surprise in digging into this material, the surprise for me was not that things happened so quickly from 74 to 76. It was in just how important John Adams was to this period, as well as a kind of behind-the-scenes, arm-twisting, get into people's faces kind of politician.
Adams' time in Philadelphia was consumed with official meetings and after-hour debates with other congressional delegates at the nearby tavern. He was a natural leader and a savvy politician. Thomas Jefferson was not.
Thomas Jefferson is just such a complicated figure. He was very young, right, in 1776, I think 32. And he was already famous as of 1774 as a writer for that pamphlet, The Summary View. But he was not really a man of politics, strangely. For all that we think of him as president and everything that he did, he was a very reclusive individual. He was an intellectual. I think of him as a person who really lived so intensively in the world of ideas that he failed routinely to make the transition from ideas to the world of material realities.
He largely kept to himself and was not invited to join Congress until 1775. Before then, he had taken to mailing Congress long-winded political musings that were rarely taken seriously. Even when he traveled to Philadelphia, Jefferson kept his distance.
He chooses lodgings that are remote from where the other delegates are living. And it's a really strong contrast to John Adams, whose lodgings were across the street from the city tavern, which is where the members of Congress, politicked late into the night after they had finished their official sessions. So they met, right, only in that fall of 1775 when Jefferson finally joined Congress. But somehow between the fall of 75 and the spring of 1776, they had developed more of a relationship. And so Adams called on him as a writer when they got to the moment of being ready to write the Declaration.
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and the nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. The Declaration of Independence is not just an important historical document. It's a masterpiece of democratic writing. The men who debated, wrote, and edited the Declaration of Independence weren't just announcing their colony's independence from a global empire. They were announcing one of the boldest political experiments in human history. The stakes were high, and so were their ambitions.
They had a very clear-eyed view of what it takes to achieve democratic or republican forms of politics, this kind of thinking about principle and organizational form. That didn't mean they had the answers for all time in terms of what would count as realizing those ideals in that form, but rather they did charge every succeeding generation with participating in that project of thinking, of democratic thinking. One can't succeed as a democratic citizen, and democratic people can't succeed without being thoughtful about democracy, about what the core ideals of liberty and equality mean, and about what kinds of organizational form can realize them. The word equality is used in the very first sentence when the colonists say that they intend to claim their separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. And what they mean exactly is that these 13 little puny colonies are going to insist on their equality to the mighty empire of Britain or France or Spain. So that has to provoke a question, right? In what sense could they possibly think of themselves as equal? It's clearly not in terms of wealth. It's clearly not in terms of military power. It's clearly not in terms of sort of longevity of political institutions. So it's exactly one thing, and that is it's simply that they've acquired the capacity for self-government to organize their own lives. And they have that capacity in the same way that Britain has it, in the same way that France has it. So that capacity for self-government is an on-off switch. You either have it or you don't. Once you have it, you're equal to any other nation, organization that has it. And so then what you lay claim to when you've got that capacity for self-government is the right of everybody else to leave you alone. So it's an idea that you can't interfere with us because we've figured out how to organize our lives. Yeah, you have to really remember that they're writing this in a world that is populated by monarchs, and not only monarchs, but monarchs who have been sort of going around the world grabbing one after another bit of land and simply claiming it as their own and pulling it into their economy. So to identify this capacity of self-governance as something that justifies pushing back on all that sort of imperial overreach was a radical thing, a real moment of transformation for the world.
The significance of this moment was not lost on the delegates. Everyone who gathered in Philadelphia in 1776 knew that the ideas they committed to in the Declaration would have implications for generations to come. And agreeing upon which ideas would make the cut was no easy task.
Now, the important thing is that as they made decisions together, they routinely had to compromise. The point of democratic politics is that you achieve a decision where some people go along with it for one reason and other people go along with it for another reason. So consequently, even in our founding documents, there are lots of phrases and ideas that meant different things to different people. I take pursuit of happiness to be a very good example of this. So the use of pursuit of happiness in the Declaration was an egalitarian idea for somebody like John Adams, who never held slaves, thought slavery was a bad thing. When they wrote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration and did not use the word property, they were keeping out the key term that slaveholders had begun to use in their defense of slavery. Clearly, for the Southerners who were defending slavery, pursuit of happiness was compatible with their own desire to keep slavery. So that phrase, its capaciousness, is part of why it worked. It permitted a compromise, but that also means people had very different interpretations of its meaning.
But politics aside, the founders were not compromising on substance. With the Declaration, they were making an argument about the fundamental purpose of government, and they looked to the great thinkers in Western philosophy for inspiration. For the Greek and Roman philosophers like Socrates and Epicurus, happiness was a weighty ideal. Happiness, like justice, was a civic virtue, vital to the collective well-being of a society. The pursuit of happiness was not just a phrase that the founders could all agree upon. It built on a philosophical tradition championed by the great minds of democratic Greece and Republican Rome.
So there are two areas of major compromise in the Declaration. One is around slavery and the other is around religion. So you had a group of 56 men in Congress with very different relationships to religion. And I think we lose track of just how diverse those views were. So you had people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson on the one hand. So Franklin is a self-avowed deist. Jefferson sort of never quite fessed up to it, but was in effect a deist. Very unconventional in their thinking about religion and so forth. Then you have people like John Adams, who was, trying out all the different sorts of sermons around the city and very kind of conventionally pious person. Roger Sherman, a Puritan, so committed to one very specific theological view. So religion certainly mattered. It was certainly part of the conversation. And the language that you get from the Declaration is very specifically open-ended, not committed to any particular theological doctrine and so forth. Not even Christian in the vocabulary. And so I think as we reflect on founding documents, we have to start by recognizing that actually lots of what we see in founding documents meant different things to different people at the time.
On June 28th, the Committee of Five presented their historic final draft to the Continental Congress for revision and approval. On July 1st, Congress was prepared to vote. 9 of the 13 colonies voted to adopt the Declaration of Independence. New York abstained. The Delaware delegation was split. Pennsylvania and South Carolina voted no. South Carolina's Edward Rutledge proposed a vote the next day. That next day, South Carolina reversed its vote. Another representative from Delaware arrived to vote yes, breaking the delegation's tie. Pennsylvania joined New York and abstained. With no colonies objecting, the Declaration of Independence was adopted. Still, the document's final edits had yet to be made. 4 copies of the Declaration of Independence were commissioned by Congress. The first was a poster from the printer John Dunlap for distribution to the military and foreign governments. The second was the official copy, written by the Secretary of Congress for the official congressional record. The third version was the parchment that everyone signed. And the fourth commission was for 13 copies, one for each state, to be printed by Mary Catherine Goddard of Baltimore.
There's an important difference in this group of 4. So in order to explain it, I'm going to have to tell you what the second sentence of the Declaration is. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever a form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle, and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. It's a very long sentence. We often forget how long it is because some of the official versions that we now have of the Declaration have a period after pursuit of happiness, breaking that sentence into 2. So of those 4 official texts that I described, the fourth, the Mary Catherine Goddard printing, has a period after pursuit of happiness. Adams and Jefferson both wrote this as a single sentence. It's this incredibly beautiful sentence. It's not merely eloquent, but it's also very carefully crafted. And if you boil the sentence down, it roughly goes like this. People have rights. Governments are instituted to secure rights. When governments aren't succeeding at that, you have to change them so that they succeed at that. And you lose sight of that argument if you stop reading at Pursuit of Happiness.
The period likely came from a printer, Benjamin Town, who got his hands on a copy of the Declaration and printed it in his newspaper on July 6th. Mary Catherine Goddard likely used Town's version when printing the 13 individual copies for each colony. And so, the period persists today. But Timothy Matlack, who wrote the official parchment that the congressional delegates would sign, had a much clearer sense of Congress's vision.
So Timothy Matlack was a low-level clerk who worked for Congress. And he was, many things, including somebody who loved cockfights, apparently, and got into street brawls, but he was also a very elegant calligrapher. And he made at least 2 important contributions to the text. He put a long dash after pursuit of happiness and another long dash after consent of the governed. And what that does is it actually brings out the structure of the sentence. It was an extremely elegant, thoughtful job of calligraphy. The other thing that he did at an important point at the end of the list of grievances, they summarized their complaints about the king by saying that in every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress. And he capitalizes we there. None of the previous manuscripts or versions had capitalized that we. And I just think it's a lovely moment where the clerk is claiming his own role in this. He's participating too. So we, the people, petition for redress. I see it as the moment where the we of the people comes to exist when he capitalizes that.
Still today, Matlack's capitalized we reminds us that work of the Declaration was entrusted to all Americans. In July 1776, with a revolution now on the horizon, the founders knew the Declaration of Independence was just a beginning.
To read the Declaration is to be asked to think about politics. They tried harder than anybody else to figure it out, and they figured out a lot of really smart things. But that doesn't absolve us of the responsibility to do our own thinking, again, about core principles of democracy, liberty, and equality. So the charge to a democratic people to do its thinking about its principles and its organizational form are right there in the Declaration. We the people are enjoined to institute government on the foundation of principle and using organizational form that to us seems likely to affect our safety and happiness. And so for me, the Declaration is empowering. It is a good thing for people to read because it reminds us of that responsibility and then gives us an example of how one people carried that responsibility out.